Well, it looks like we've probably waited long enough. So I will introduce myself right now as if we have a few stragglers coming in. My name is Michael Leiblein. My role here today is, I'm the Assistant Program Chair for the STR division this year. I've been given the honor, and it is quite an honor, to facilitate this discussion with our distinguished scholar, Jay Barney. So I will turn over most of this to the group after introducing Jay. I'll just ask that if you are here, initially mute your microphone so we don't get as much background noise or we minimize the level of background noise. I'll also ask you to, I know we have at least signed up many junior faculty and PhD students. I'm sure Jay would love to hear your questions and respond to those. So please feel free to use the chat function, raise any questions you'd like to ask over our 2-hour period. I've got a set of questions I can start us off on, but I really want to, I hope I talk less and you guys talk more. So that's at least my goal for this, this function. So let me move to my to the man that needs no introduction, Jay Barney. Jay is the Presidential Professor of Strategic Management and Lassonde Chair of Social Entrepreneurship at the University of Utah. His PhD is from Yale. Somebody should ask him about this transition from his PhD education to strategic management at some time during this little chat. He has honorary PhDs from several institutions. I don't know if the word is he's wrapping up his time as editor-in-chief of the AMR.
That turns out to be a process, not an event.
Well, we thank you for your service. I did a little bit of background work. Over 300 articles published. The stunning item for me was the Google Scholar. I think this changes every week by, it seems like 1,000 numbers, but over 170,000 citations on Google Scholar. I did go through the exercise of how many years it would take me to catch up if you stopped, and that just got depressing. So certainly well-recognized, well-established work, recognized with awards from the Academy of Management, the Strategic Management Society, as a fellow of the Academy of Management and Strategic Management Society, several major awards for scholarly contributions from the Academy. You see here listed in 2010. From the SMS last year, the C.K. Prahalad Award, and this year from AIB, the J. Fayerweather Eminent Scholar Award. Further recognition, one of the top 50 most influential papers published in management science, as well as several best paper awards with junior faculty and PhD students. So I saw best paper awards with Sharon Alvarez, Lowell Buznitz, and Ty Mackey, and I'm sure there may be others that I've missed, so I apologize for that. But we are welcome. Super happy to have you here with us, Jay. What I'll do is sort of stop the share now, start the conversation with any ideas you want to share, and then maybe we can get some Q&A going. And again, hopefully inviting those of us who are on the call with us to add their contributions to the chat. Any questions they have for you to the chat, excuse me.
Okay, fine. So you're going to ask me some questions now,
I'm going to ask you some questions unless you want to make an opening statement.
I don't have, this is not a
okay.
Debate.
You can make fun of Rich's background or not.
No, that Rich's is awesome. I like that. I like the,
I've got a better one, but that's a different.
That's right. That's right.
Put on a roller coaster, actually.
So Michael asked me about a background with the moose. Have you seen the moose at my house before? I don't think you have, but we routinely, well, routinely is too much, but in the fall, we get moose in our yard roughly once or twice a week. And that never gets boring, it turns out. There's a moose, and we get excited and we go look at it. And it turns out they're very large animals, so you have to be a little careful around them.
So see, now we know something about you.
So Michael, you came to the house once. You saw the deer, at least, I imagine.
I saw the deer. Listen, I've been in Moose Look, Maguntic, Maine, so I'm just waiting to see Moose Look something in Utah. But so maybe a typical. Oh my God,
this is going to a new level there.
So maybe to start us off, oftentimes in these chats, we've tried to get a little bit of background about the scholar. So, if you could open up with some ideas of how did you make this transition to academia? What were you doing before entering the doctoral program at Yale? And maybe reflect on that, your early transition from the real world into the academic world.
So I was, my original goal in life when I started college was to become a lawyer. I thought I had the gift of gab, which I think mistakenly thought that was something that was required to be a lawyer. There are lawyers with great gift of gab, but it's mostly writing, it turns out, but in my experience anyway. Then I discovered, I went to Brigham Young University as an undergraduate, and I discovered two things about college that I did not know. The first is I really liked it. And the second was I was really good at it. I mean, I had been an indifferent high school student. I think I averaged Bs. I studied twice in high school. I still remember those two events. One was a French vocabulary test, and this, had memorized a long list of words. And then the second one was an Algebra 2 test. And that was it. And so, you get Bs and you just go through and have a good time. But then I got to college. I thought, well, maybe I'll study. And it turns out that actually helps. Who knew? But I really fell in love with ideas. It was just like, wow, these are like, I hadn't thought about these things before. And while I was clearly stumbling around trying to figure out ideas for myself, I was nevertheless impressed with ideas. I originally majored in sociology as an undergraduate, and so decided to, since what career advice do we give people? If you find something you love and you're good at it, make that your career. So I just went to college and never left. So unlike a lot of people, I did not take 2 or 3 years off and work or anything like that. I had some small jobs, part-time jobs, but nothing like a career or anything like that. And instead just went right to graduate school. So I started college early, and I started graduate school early. So that was like, I think I was 20 when I started as a PhD student. My original area was in sociology at Yale, which has a good sociology department. After the first year and a half, I was studying mathematical sociology and social network theory in the sociology department, working with some people who were probably really well known still really well known in the social network area. But after taking all the stats classes and methods classes and the math classes and things, it became clear to me that I needed to get a substantive area to study. That is, I need to marry the methods with a topic. And so they had a series of seminars, PhD seminars, on topics in sociology. But back then, and I don't know if this is true or not today, but back then there weren't any sort of classes on general theory, broader theoretical issues in sociology. They were very topical, like the sociology of sports, which would have been cool, but I didn't do it. Or the sociology of medicine, or the sociology of science, or the sociology. And so they were very data driven. They were very fact based, descriptive almost. And some had, I'm not discounting all that work, of course, but some had some broader theoretical implications. But as I read the materials in advance, I wasn't, none of them captured my imagination. So it turns out, fortuitously, that the old sociology department at Yale was literally right across the street from the School of Organization and Management. So I wandered over there and ended up taking a doctoral seminar from a guy named Bob Miles. Some of you may know Bob. I imagine he's retired. He was with Emory, left Yale, went to Harvard, and then went to Emory. I took a class in organization theory from him, so sociology of organizations. And so that was the trend. And then that became interesting to me. And then I ended up forming a joint degree, the only joint PhD ever, I believe, between sociology and the School of Organization and Management, and finished my dissertation. Although my dissertation was primarily from the sociology background, it was a application of social network modeling techniques on a big data set. Basically,
I recall you published in some odd places from those early years.
well, I mean, you're not odd if you're a sociologist. I mean, I published an article in journals called Social Networks.
Surprising places.
Yes. Well, actually, publication was, my experience with publication early on in my career. My first year as a assistant professor at UCLA, I think I published one paper in the Academy of Management Review, and it was actually pretty easy to get done. I mean, I wrote it up, they gave me some comments, I made revision, and was accepted. I thought, oh, geez, this publication, and people say this is hard. This is not that difficult. I mean, I just did this easily. And then 5 years later, I published my second paper. But I was working really hard, trust me. I was always writing and always had stuff, but stuff was just not clicking. And so it took, so I discovered, in fact, this publication stuff is actually really hard. The first one was the aberration, not the typical thing. I tell students even today, I say, there's been no publication of mine ever that I didn't have to claw and fight my way into the journal. I mean, this is never easy for anybody. It's never been easy for me. Yeah, it says more about me than anything else, but that's absolutely the case.
Well, since you've started, so Asim has reminded me that, and we have made this public, Jay is about to win another major award, so that's in the chat. So thank you for raising that, Asim. We're unsure if when we were gonna publicize that exactly, but what's interesting is we've got some questions from Professor McGann and Professor McAdock that are getting right to it. So,
okay, go right ahead.
In your own words, Anita, so let's let this conversation of community, and can you help us?
Sure. So I can't wait to hear the answers to Rich's questions, but they'll put us on an emotional roller coaster, I'm sure. But my question has more to do with community. So what I've acknowledged here is that one of the most wonderful things about Jay, and there are very, very many wonderful things about Jay, but one of them is how great he is at creating scholarly community. And I can testify that Jay is a feminist. He's championed me and many of our friends. He's an advocate for junior scholars, for doctoral students. He cares about each of us as individuals. And all of that are part of the ingredients of creating community around Jay, which I every day come to value even more. And I've written here that for many years, my rule of thumb at conferences was, where's the OSU party? And now it's, where's the Utah party? And Mike, I'm sorry about that. I apologize.
So am I.
I still go to the OSU.
That's another story.
I wanted to ask how we sustain academic community now that we're on Zoom instead of together in person, since all of that sort of warmth and affective connection is so different.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would actually, I suspect that the notion of a sense of community, a common culture, a commitment towards scholarship and to each other is actually even more important in the world of Zoom world, where it's sort of easy to just go out to lunch and have interesting conversations, but that's hard to do now. And so we have to become more aggressive. I'm sure we're still learning how to do that. It is the case that we just hired a new postdoc, and I actually had a chance to have lunch with her. Up to this point, I've had 3 interactions with her via Zoom, and I said, I don't even know if you have legs. I mean, it's really such a bizarre interaction, in fact, way to interact with each other. But we had lunch, but I found, and it's early days, but she's got great data. She's got an interesting question. She didn't know how to position that in the strategy literature. I think that we were able to accomplish a lot in these kinds of interactions, really interesting conversations. It is the case. I don't want to get sanguine here, but building communities is about caring about each other, you know, and it's caring intellectually, which is extremely important, because if we don't have those intellectual connections, then it's a social club, and I'm not interested in that. I can do that elsewhere. So it's about caring about each other, but also being proactive in sharing that caring. So we've had some recent sad events in our department. This is not for public. I'm just mentioning there's some individuals that have faced some difficult times, and I've been impressed with how our faculty have reached out, not in an overbearing way. It's always a tough issue to do, but to balance. But and I think that in the long run, that's what where a sense of intellectual community comes from, is this sense of personal caring. Now, if someone is trying to figure out then how can they help build an intellectual community, first you got to care about the people, and I can't do anything about that. That's up to you. I will say that some of my fondest memories are events, many of which Anita attended, by the way, where we got people with really diverse backgrounds together in a really cool setting. I created this conference with Jeff Harrison it's called Crossroads and Stakeholder Theory. And it was an extension of the SMS conference in Denver. And I said, let's run this conference at Zion National Park. And if you've never been there before, it is a breathtaking place. And I think that it's interesting. I think there's been an intellectual community that's come out of that event over the years. But a diverse set of people joined in a common interest in a broad question, and then the actual experience was one of conversation, not debate. It was one of learning from each other rather than trying to dominate the conversation. And I know it's had a big impact on my work and some of the work that Nina and I are doing together. It's a hard thing to figure out how to do, Nina, but.
Well, maybe that's something we can even come back to. Or Anita, you want to follow up on that?
No, I think it's a great segue to Rich's questions.
Yeah. So Rich, you've got, several questions here, but we group them together in your words.
Okay.
Rich, I did do a shtick in Rich's PhD seminar.
I know. I usually just press play, and Jay goes for about 40 minutes, and at the end we have a few questions.
But this I like this. This is good. So, what's your questions, Rich?
This is complimentary to that. So, what in your experience, what does it mean to be a good colleague?
Oh, gee.
And who have you observed being an especially good colleague, and what made them so good at it?
Oh, wow. So I think that, but these are much different questions than I expected. I thought we'd be talking about the difference between transaction cost economics and research-based, whatever. I see a little girl. What's your name? Yeah.
You're muted.
Yeah, so her name is Mary.
Hi, how are you? Many years ago, a doctoral student told me about, he was having a phone call with a colleague, and he had a 4-year-old daughter or son, I don't remember, but 4-year-old child, and they were talking about some of my work, and the doctor said, "No, Barney says this," and then "No, Barney says that." And this little 4-year-old was getting all excited, Barney. And finally, the dad said, "No, sweetheart, you have your Barney, we have our Barney." How do you be a good colleague? How do you be a good friend? Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the same question. In hiring decisions, we try to hire in anticipation of collegiality. This life is too short to work with miserable people. It just is. And if they're not going to be willing to well, the language you would use, make specific investments in each other, then the possibility of co-creation is very low. So so first of all, it comes with selection, and then if someone lets you be a good colleague, then it starts with caring about them, being a friend, and I don't know. I always thought I had an obligation that when we hired a PhD student or brought a PhD student on or hired an assistant professor, that there was an implicit contract there that said our job is to help them be successful. If they fail, which happens a lot, I'm not saying that I have this worked out 100% or anything, but if they fail, that's partly my responsibility. I didn't give them the mentoring they needed, or I hired the wrong person. I mean, if you can get excited about a person and think about their ideas, but that they don't have a willingness to work hard and dedication and a creativity and an openness to learning, those kinds of things, then that's not going to be successful. I can't do much about those. So we try to select on those criteria. But then, assuming we've done that well and the person struggles, then their struggle is my struggle. I think that's actually very much the case. Now, you don't. This is going to sound very, very bad, but it's kind of like raising children. You can't give them everything. You can't spoon feed them. They have to learn to fail. They have to learn on their own. They have to have those challenges. But there are some people who are open to those kinds of mentoring opportunities. Others, I mean, I think I've had some. I was talking to one co-author on the phone and just really giving them a difficult time. You got to this is changing. My wife said, "You are so mean." So I thought it was actually being helpful, but it's straightforward. So I don't pretend. But I guess it starts with a sense of responsibility, I will also say one more thing. I really, one of the big mistakes I made as an assistant professor is I adopted the assumption, I'm not sure why, I'm sure there's some deep reason for it. I adopted the assumption that somehow publication and success in this field was a zero-sum game, that if Rich Maculach published a paper, that somehow that means I wouldn't publish a paper. That's of course absurd. It's not a zero-sum game at all. It's in fact it is in fact an intellectual community using this language. I would say some of my best friends are my colleagues around the world in strategic management, and so if you begin with understanding that it's a community and a sense of, and that we have a common sense of purpose, and that it, in fact, is not a zero-sum game. When Rich publishes another brilliant paper, that actually makes me more successful because I'm able to read it, understand it, and it has an impact on my work. And that's what it means to be part of the intellectual community. So,
don't make life any more of a competition than it has to be.
Well, I mean, there's enough, especially today. I mean, there's enough fracturing and arguing and discussion. And by the way, I'm not arguing, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have debates and disagreements. Everyone here who knows me knows I am more than willing to engage in intellectual debate and conversation, but I have actually never found any intellectual point or political point that was worth sacrificing a friendship. None. So if it comes, if it's moving in that direction, I just stop. It's not worth it. I don't want to win an argument and lose a friend. The friend is something that will pay dividends for everybody, including the two of us, for decades. Wow, this is so different than I expected.
We got better questions.
I don't know.
We got better questions coming from the pool. We're crowdsourcing. And maybe we'll come back to Rich on the mentorship and rookie talks later, but I heard the fragmentation comment, which ties into something Tammy Madsen has raised. So maybe Tammy, you want to talk about raise your question to the group. And again, if there's junior folks on the call who want to pipe in, please add your
Hey,
questions to
Tammy.
the chat.
You're muted.
There you
There you
go. So, thanks, Jay. Thanks for your time, and thanks to STR Division for doing all these events. They're fantastic. So, you know, the field is sort of evolving and ebbs and flows, fragmented, core, non-fragmented. We seem to be spreading out quite a bit. That periphery continues to spread out further and further. And
Sure.
I wonder if you could speak to what your thoughts are about how the field's evolving. Where do you see it? Where do you see some fruitful avenues for sort of the way that we think about the field of strategy in the future? And how can strategy research help to sort of integrate some of these ideas that are kind of somewhat distant from the original kind of core canonical questions?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I'm writing an essay for Michael's journal on sort of, if you go back to the fundamental issues in strategy book that was edited by Thies, Rimmelt, and Dan Schendel, coming out of the conference in Napa. And then asking how we've done, are these two questions still important? So I'm beginning to think about those issues a little bit. Before I started AMR, I wanted to get a sense of the strategy field. I was going to make some editorial policy changes at AMR. For example, it was going to be okay to submit mathematical models and simulations. But yeah, it just happened. But before I did that, I wanted to see, because those were mostly going to be in strategy, a little bit in OT, but mostly in strategy. I wanted to see what percentage of strategy papers were actually using models and simulations. So the result of that was I went through, I think it was 7-8 years of SMJs, and just read the abstract enough to get a sense of to count the number of modeling versus and simulation papers. By the way, it's about 8 to 10%. So at least it was back then. But I asked that, but it had another effect, which was as I read those articles, each article was deeply impressive. I mean, really, I mean, just so sophisticated technically, and multiple robustness checks, and just absolutely nailed things. Really impressive. I wasn't sure it added up to much, by the way. Oh, that was the problem, is that each article was amazing, but just reading the article published in SMJ, I didn't understand what strategy was about. I found that a little discouraging. But on the other hand, I mean, you have to take a long-term view of these things. In the early 80s, the field was dominated by a series of what, at least to us, were new theories. You think about positioning theory and positioning theory, resource-based theory, evolutionary theory, transaction cost theory, incomplete contracting. I've probably missed some, but you get the point. And this was in the 80s and early 90s. I mean, think about that. It was just like it was the golden age of theorizing in the field of strategy. And then for the next decade or so, there was a lot of work that's testing the empirical implications of those theories and putting them off against each other. There was really a lot of people on the screen here have contributed to that part of the conversation. And then there's been, I think more recently, in the time that I look like, there was a move away from trying to test implications of one of these core theories to really much more research that was very carefully done empirical work, examining a particular data set. It's methods finding data set, and then somehow we'll try to link it to strategy in some broad way. My expectation is that over time that too will get old, and we'll see that it has limitations. It has great strengths. I'm not here criticizing the work. I said each of these articles are awesome, but what do they add up to? Then people will say, you know, strategy needs to be more than just about trying to apply rigorous methods to analyze a data set. It has to be about answering questions that are uniquely strategic in nature. And so my expectation is that over time that it's very likely we'll see another movement emerge where people like yourselves will start trying to bring these disparate papers together and start asking bigger questions or more fundamental questions. The thing about us as a field is you can define our core research question in a variety of ways, but I mean, these days I'm sort of drawn to the profit generation appropriation model, but there are others, and they all have advantages, disadvantages, and they're closely linked anyway. So, but you know, we still haven't exactly completely answered that question. You know, it's still a really hard question. And by the way, as a field linked with practice to some extent, it's a question that is deeply interesting to many managers. And so I'm actually, I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that as the field matures, by which I mean another generation of young people come together and say, you know, my career has to be more than just publishing the next empirical examination of the data set in a top journal. It has to be me more than that, and that would be the thing I would look hopefully will happen.
Well, yeah, that's great. I think that you'll be happy to hear. I think Asim and Zhao were doing a similar exercise that you did for AMR with the STR division, and that's had some influence on how the new editorial team at AMJ is going to be receptive to particular theory and methods keywords. So
really?
Keeping on the good work.
Great. I'm glad to hear that, Asim. What did you do? Did you look at AMJ publications or?
Actually, it wasn't so much AMJ. It was the stream of papers we get coming into the Academy of Management conference,
okay.
right? So we took all the keywords and we sort of figured out what the themes were, and AMJ was kind enough to allow us to sort of suggest new keywords. So the AMJ keywords are actually going to change.
Oh, really?
To reflect, you know, some of the new thinking in the field of strategy, as well as. And actually, I mean, the interesting thing is STR actually covers a lot of things that AMJ doesn't think of as strategy, right? So social movements and, you know, stakeholder theory doesn't actually get counted under strategy. It's counted under social, you know, issues and management, which, you know, I'm sure you have some thoughts on. But so we are actually trying to sort of kind of change what the keywords are. And
very good. I'm glad to hear that. That's great.
And AMR is doing likewise, is adopting the STR keyword.
Oh yeah. What's interesting is
this is across the Academy journals. The intent here was to try to ensure that they reflect sort of the full audience that the Academy serves, and not just a subset of that audience, shall we say.
Yeah, Tammy is being very politically correct. Yeah, I mean, I actually have data on this that I think confirms many of our suspicions. For a period of roughly, I'd have to look up the data, but it was like 5 or 6 years, I think it's something like that. I categorized all of the papers that had been published in AMR or had been accepted and were forthcoming in AMR, and I categorized them into micro, macro. It's very hard to do anything besides very broad categories. So it's a methodological flaw, but nevertheless, it was just me. And I think it was 87% were micro. And that's just, you know, these are Academy journals. These are not OB journals. And by the way, I'm not criticizing any of those articles. I'm not saying they were bad articles. I mean, they were really pretty good. But the intellectual diversity is really an important issue. And so I'm glad to hear you guys are dealing with that. Anita, you had a question?
I was just going to say this relates to Tammy's point about fragmentation, because what's happening is that there are several divisions of the Academy that are very large, that are micro-oriented, that organizational behavior, organizational theory, that have a kind of agglomerations of other types of divisions around them, such as, HRM and industrial relations, and on the OMT side, there's various methods, divisions, and so on, and they tend to be overrepresented in the academy, because in the academy leadership and in the journal leadership, because the people tend to vote in the academy elections for members of their own divisions in the elections. So it's very important for us to vote. So and if you don't know who to vote for, I would recommend learning a little bit about the candidates, because it matters a lot to how much access we have to journals, to academy journals, and how much visibility we have. Sorry.
Well, the good news at AMR. So one of the things I'm probably the most proud of at AMR was that I created a really intellectually diverse AE panel. Choosing your associate editors is everything. That's the whole story, because they make 90% of the substantive decisions. And my goal, I stated explicit goal, was to choose a panel of AEs that as soon as you read that person's name, you would know the work they had done, and you would know they had contributed theoretically important area. And we did that. I mean, it's an impressive group. And the good news is Sherry Thatcher, who is the AMR editor, the new AMR editor, has, I think, done about the same thing. I mean, Rich, you're on the board. You're an AE, right? And Kyle Meyer's an AE. And I mean, these are people that we know and respect. And the OB folks are also people that we know and respect. So I think hopefully that the need for that intellectual diversity is becoming institutionalized to some extent. It's funny about stakeholder. There are two stakeholder theories, by the way. There are two completely different worlds out there. And every once in a while, they bump into each other, and it's not pretty. So it's fun to watch, but a hard problem to solve.
So maybe a way to transition to this is Trevor Israelson had a question. Maybe it was about communicating ideas. I'll let Trevor ask that, but I mean, maybe it's not just even strategy scholars given this, but the broader management community.
Sure.
So Trevor, you want to rephrase your question?
Yeah, so I was intrigued, Jay, when you were talking at first about your own journey through the PhD program in sociology and then coming into management and being familiar with your work. It's apparent that you had this unorthodox approach that you were communicating very effectively to an audience of strategic management scholars. And I feel like a lot of my work the way that I think about things is kind of seen as unorthodox. And I want to figure out how to communicate it more persuasively to strategy scholars.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to do. I don't have an algorithm. Plug in paper outcome persuasion. It would be nice. I said earlier that I've never had a paper that I didn't have to claw and scratch my way into publication. And it's always a hard process. It's always difficult. I do think that, so certainly one of the things I saw at AMR, which was a little discouraging, was just overall sloppiness in writing. Just like, you didn't use the right word. It's just one word out of the entire paper, but it turns out to be the critical word, and you used the wrong word, and you don't, the people who write with me when we finally get to close to final drafts are always amazed. I'm a pretty easygoing guy, whatever you want to do is fine. I'm pretty flexible, and then all of a sudden I become this anal compulsive. No, that's the wrong dang word. We got to use that word, not that word. But then aren't they synonyms? No, but there's a nuance here. I mean, I just go crazy. I was talking to my wife about this recently. She's often gives me good insights and about myself. And she, and the question that came up was about writing. And she reviews, she's a professional genealogist, and she reviews, she helps get genealogists get the credit, and she writes the test and evaluates them, those kinds of things. She says, and some people just can't write. It's just like this is the first sentence in their report is not a complete sentence. This is not a good sign, okay? And I said, I quoted to her the first paragraph of a paper that I wrote, well, now almost 20 years ago. And she said, you quoted it? And he says, yeah. It took me 6 weeks to write the first paragraph. I mean, I've never worked as hard on anything as that first paragraph, except the second paragraph, which I also can almost quote. And this is 20 years ago. So it's to me, it's a matter of that kind of focus and dedication. You know, we get feedback from good friends, and they tell us lies, so that's not useful. So, you know, I always say you get feedback from acquaintances, you get the truth. It can't be strangers because they won't do it. So, but acquaintances, you might be able to get that from. But just a commitment to just being very, very careful and precise in your conversation. With regard to the particular question of how do you come to, if you have an unorthodox approach, how do you communicate that? I think it's actually, we can learn a little bit from good salespeople. You know this is a good idea. You believe strongly it's a good idea. In fact, no, it's not believing. You know it's a good idea. The problem is I don't know it's a good idea. So your task is to figure out how your solution can fix one of my problems. And it may not even be a problem I know I have. And so that becomes the persuasion experience. And so, knowing your audience here is extremely important. One of the costs of not having our meetings together is that the way that you get to know this audience to write to them is just to hang around. It's not going to a particular paper session. Well, that can be helpful, or a panel session that can be actually more helpful. But just go to dinner with these people and what are the questions that are burning for them what are they frustrated about in their own work? Why are they not making progress? And then if you can figure out a way to solve their problem, then all of a sudden they're on your side. So I always tell people, don't lead with your chin. Don't say, everything that's ever been written about this topic is stupid. And let me explain to you why. Well, you're going to get those reviewers and they're not going to respond. But if instead you say, one of the challenges in the area has been this, and we all agree with that problem, but it turns out there's another way of solving it. And now you're a hero. You've said the same thing, but now you're a hero instead of a villain. So, but just pay attention to detail and then figure out how to solve someone's problems, and then you'll be able to be successful. I mean, let me give you a specific example. So I wrote this paper on stakeholders and competitive advantage and economic profit. And I originally submitted to AMR. This is before I was the editor of AMR, obviously. And the editor, I mean, he's a reasonable guy, and his choice was to send it out to I think he was thinking relatively friendly reviewers that were stakeholder people. But I wasn't solving a problem with them. See, they were already true believers. So it wasn't a matter for them of trying to convince them. They were already convinced. And so they kept saying, well, why don't you use this argument? Because this is well established in the stakeholder literature. Or use this argument, this is well established in the stakeholder literature. Well, I didn't write that paper for stakeholder people. I wrote the paper for strategy people. I needed strategy reviewers, not stakeholder reviewers. Because I think I can solve a problem for strategy people, but I can't solve the problem for stakeholder people since they've already solved that problem for themselves. So, So that paper went through a couple rounds and it was going in the wrong direction. And one of the great advantages of being a full professor and all those things is I can say, this is not going right, I withdrew the paper. Now, I used the excuse that I was becoming the editor of the AMR to withdraw the paper, although technically I could have continued. I think it would have not looked good. But, and I resubmitted SMJ, and then I got two reviewers, that I was solving a problem that they had. And all of a sudden, I was the good guy. Instead of being redundant, I was being new. When I present that paper, I start by saying, if you're a stakeholder person, this is not going to change your mind already at all, because you're already there. But if you're a strategy person like me, who for 40 years or 30 years, whatever, argue that for shareholder supremacy, then you should listen carefully because you may change your mind. I'm going to solve a problem for you. So that's a specific example.
Yeah, I see two questions. I want to make sure we're engaging our junior folks, and I see two questions. One is from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Zhang Cheng, and talking about linking a behavioral perspective to strategy. And a second is from Nikisha, and asking a lot about joining the conversation, and in particular, a litmus test to make sure you're part of this. And I think I've heard some of this in your recent comments. Go to the academy and have lunch with somebody and understand their parts, their challenges. I recall you had an AMR paper where you were talking about, you sort of gap analysis that you would go through and how you would link to two different audiences and maybe solve a problem for them. And maybe that would be helpful. I mean, I'll invite Zhang Cheng and Nikisha to sort of pipe in, but it seems to me that experience might be helpful to what they're trying to ask.
Well, when we define, there's two kinds of contributions at AMR. One of them is where you take a current body of literature and you extend it in some new direction. And then, and 90% of the papers that are published at AMR are in that category. And then there's the papers that say, interesting, but this entire conversation is wrong. What we need is a radical change. And that's a less common event. Higher risk in some ways, but also high returns if it works. Junior people ask me sometimes, they start by saying, does it really make sense to try to write theory papers? I'm a very weird guy on lots of dimensions, but one of the ways that I'm weird is that I have almost no empirical papers. I think maybe 6 or 7. And I'm always the third author because I'm the theory guy and they worry about the methods guy. I'm the methods. Now remember, my original work was in mathematical sociology. I actually taught the statistics classes to the PhD students, MBA students at Yale. I was one of the TAs. So I mean, it's not that I'm anti-methods and those kinds of things. That's what I sort of did for a long time. But most of my work is theory work. And so junior people said, should I take the risks of writing a theory paper? Writing that sounds so difficult, and on and on. Well, I've always thought that our best hope for really innovative theory, that is the second kind of innovation, comes from assistant professors, doctoral students. Because the rest of us have spent sometimes decades becoming so ossified in a particular point of view that we helped create our own in some ways intellectually, that we're useless when it comes to innovation. I mean, it's going to be much harder for us. I'll just, as a personal example, again, speaking to this 2018 SMJ paper on stakeholders. The essential insight of that paper, to the extent there is one, already existed in my 1986 management science paper on strategic factor markets. I just wasn't smart enough to see it. It took me 30 years to sort of figure out one of the implications of the paper that I wrote. It's a very weird thing to sort of say that I didn't understand my own paper fully. But younger people who aren't so committed to a particular theoretical point of view, it seems to me, may have intellectual flexibility do that. So yeah, is it risky? Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, but writing all papers is risky, and writing all papers are hard. That's a common thing. But for the good of the field, I actually encourage young people to try to give it a shot, to be creative, and try to do something really interesting and different.
Yeah, it resonates. I had this guy, Mike Salvini, used to run about a third of Accenture come into to a room, and it's like, every month you work with me, you're more likely to think like me. That's not what I need. I need something.
That's so right. That is so right. Well, there have been times in my own career when we hired Sharon Alvarez at Ohio State, and as part of my, what I consider, as I said earlier, part of my obligation to work with new hires, she introduced me to the entrepreneurship literature, which at the time was a mess, to be frank. I mean, it seemed to me not to be organized nicely into a set of well-formed research questions. I'm trying to be gentle here. And we started on a journey that just has led to things that I would never have thought about. And she was just an assistant professor, but I learned a lot from that process, and it's been a lot of fun, and also painful and difficult and challenging, but a lot of fun. And so that's kind of what I did. And I wrote again, in my personal career, I wrote the first 2 resource-based theory papers, the paper that became strategic factor markets, and the paper that became the general management paper. I wrote them both, the first drafts, in 1984, and I was 30 years old, so assistant professor. So, I mean, it can't happen.
So I've been asked to interrupt our interview for a brief moment. So the STR division has asked for a photo op. So I will ask those of you who are online here, if you can unhide your, turn your videos on or put a picture of you on. And I think I will get a private message when we have a photo of everybody on this call, or many of the people on this call. So if you want, you can wave and like Professor Mack do strange faces, but that's just, Okay,
we'll go. Everybody's ready? Okay. Okay, I think we're
all
good.
right. All right. We got that out of the way. There will be more fun later, I promise. This is going to fall to a seam, but that will come later. So Bucky, I see another. So I mean, I've got a set of questions. Jay's been primed for a set of questions. We're not going there. We're going to go.
Wherever you guys want to take it.
So I think this is more important to get the community engaged.
Yeah,
but Bucky, you had a question for Jay about his theory development process. Do you want to ask that in your?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. Hi, Jay. Thank you for taking the time to do this. So my question, first of all, thank you so much for saying it's okay for people who are just starting to think about coming up with theories, because given my background prior to the PhD, my brain tends to go that way. And I've put in thank you. I've put in a whole lot of effort to try and make sure that I'm sound empirically as well.
Sure.
But I was literally having a thought this morning, because I was sitting down here writing some jots early hours this morning on a paper, and I started realizing that the paper really wanted to be a theory paper, and I was sort of like stressing out over that, like, okay, maybe.
I love that language there, by the way. The paper really wanted to be a theory paper. I know exactly what that means.
Thank you. So I just thought maybe if you can tell us some more about your process of theorizing, and like, how do those ideas come up? Is it a situation where you really do look at the expanse of literature or some new work that is coming in and you're like, okay, this needs organizing, or are you more phenomenon driven and you're like, this is what I see happening in the environment or in the business that is going on right now, and this needs to be organized or put together in some sort of framework so that managers can make predictions? The latter is sort of how I'm thinking, but the trouble with that is now I have to figure out how to anchor whatever it is I'm talking about in existing literature.
Sure, sure.
So I just thought maybe if you say share some of your own process, then maybe it might give me some sort of guidance. Thank you.
Well, the elements of all those things. I do have a reasonably active consulting career that brings me into contact with real companies, real organizations, real managers sort of dealing with things. And when I see smart, successful managers doing things and saying things that don't make sense to me, that's a theory opportunity. See, so what? I don't know. Why did you say that? That's strange. Excuse me. I haven't found most managers to be particularly good theorists, by the way. So when you ask them for an explanation for why they are talking about these things, it's not very helpful normally. But that's not the point. The point is these are smart people who have an enormously developed intuition about business and strategy, and they're doing this, and it's working, and I don't understand it. I mean, a specific example, so to make it less abstract, is one of the reasons I got interested in stakeholder theory is that I have these really smart, hardworking, successful CEOs talking about stakeholders. Are you guys out of your mind? Don't you know your only job is to maximize returns to shareholders? And they would look at me and say, you know, I don't think that's right. And that would be that was one source of inspiration. Anita?
I don't know if you saw Greg Mankiw's editorial in the New York Times about how business managers are bad at maximizing.
Oh, yeah.
Did you see that?
I didn't. No.
It's. I wonder if we can find you the link. I'll try to find it for you. But he basically says that the problem with the shareholder orientation, and this is shareholder orientation post Utah conference, not the prior version. We should call it the Utah view or something. That the problem is that most managers are not very good at it. That's the reason they're failing at it. That's the reason that they're committed to the shareholder view is because they've been tooled up in business schools to do that. Asim, true to form, picked up on that and has circulated that in the chat. I wanted to build on Bucky's question and ask you, to what extent does your theorizing sometimes reflect the reality around, your experience of these firms that you consult to and the reality of the choices that the managers that you talk with, the reality that they face and the problems that they face versus, emerging from the papers in the literature?
Yeah, as I said, excuse me, I think that's important. But I don't want to overstate it. I mean, I think that our research and our theoretical work and our research can have a huge practical implications for managers, and we continue to see that going forward as this conversation continues to grow. So my theorizing is informed by practice, but it's not a simple link between, oh, I see this, therefore I ask this theoretical question. I mean, mostly it's staring at the computer until it confesses, I have described it in the past as that I write my papers backwards. That is, I start with, I would really like to be able to make this conclusion. Why? Because it would offend somebody, or it would make them have to rethink you have an intuition about what a really fun conclusion. Again, it's because of recency bias, obviously, but the SMJ 2018, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to conclude that in order for a firm to generate economic profits, they have to, more than shareholders have to be residual claimants. Not just that would be a good idea, not that it's ethically right, that it's logically a requirement. I thought I would like to be able to write a paper that showed that was true. Now, that was idea, of course, came from a context of the literature and the context of working with companies that were doing stakeholder-oriented things and all those other things. So I mean, so there was that context, but I said, can I write an argument? This is that concludes this, and of course, the way you want to do that is you write it backwards. You say, well, this is where I want to end up. So what do I have to do to get there? Step by step back until I can start with a set of assumptions or definitions that actually everybody in the field would agree with. Then I start there. So what's the definition of economic profit? What's the definition of stakeholders? And in those things, I'm not going to try to put new definitions. I'm going to take other people's definitions, other people's assumptions, and then I'm just going to go, and then I'm going to start there. And then what I want to do is I want to take a reader who completely disagrees with my conclusion and take them by the hand gently and walk them step by step through the process. And usually about 2/3 of the way through, they say, no, I don't want to go. I don't want to. But it's too late. See, they can't, they're already there. And then they get to the conclusion and they hate it, but they can't disagree with it. You're talking about the process. That's the theory writing process I try to do. And it's really hard. I'm not pretending I got it nailed. And it took me 3 years to write the SMJ 2018 paper. And to do it, I convened 2 separate conferences and from around the world. And I had so much to learn to understand what I had to do. But that was literally the process. Start with the speculation and work backwards and then write it forward so that people will understand it. So what's interesting to me in terms of its managerial implications, I think now, and it's not me, but those of us who are in this conversation, Anita and I are working on some things. I think we now have things to say to managers about stakeholders that they haven't thought of yet. I think we can proactively add to the conversation rather than just to be part of it. I'm looking at some other, we have a similar paper on this on experimentation, where there's the managerial version of when you should do experiments. And, I think we have some important things to say that contradict the sort of the traditional managerial view. So, so you want to be informed by practice, but you don't want to be constrained by practice. I guess that's what I want to say.
Well, that's really helpful. I think a further on, link. So I'm hearing this sort of this emergent process, and as Asim has well stated, a beautiful description of the way to write theory papers. So thank you for that. Randy Westgren had a question for you that I think might be useful, and there's a couple of other private conversations coming in to the chat, so maybe we'll get some more junior folks with their questions. But Randy, first you.
Hey, Randy, how are you?
I'm well, and you?
I'm good. I'm good.
So in the way that you have recast dialogue in AMR, and for myself, I'm finding this new way of having scientific conversation very interesting and very rewarding. And it's often about particularities that you can have a conversation about, as opposed to trying to deal with all 37 pages of the paper. What's the next step in the evolution of that kind of scientific conversation for those of us in STR?
Well, that's a great question. The dialogue was very hard. As the editor of AMR, it was very, very hard. I think I've reviewed how many 1.7 million papers in my career. I think that's the number is. I know how to review papers. I know how to sign them. I know that stuff is not hard, but dialogues are a different beast. They're only 8 pages long, which is right, and I'm not changing that. And in that 8 pages, you still have to make a theoretical contribution, so it has to be narrower and focused. And so it took me a long time, probably 2.5 years, 2 years, to thinking about what the dialogue should be, having some experience. And I've had really long conversations, some conversations with Sherry, the new AMR editor, about this. I don't know. I wonder what a dialogue session will look like at SMJ. And my concern would be that it would be, you know, you forgot to square the second term in the fourth regression in the correlations. I mean, which is of course useless. I mean, who could care less? Maybe not. Maybe there would be. Maybe maybe if you had a dialogue session that was more focused and carefully edited, we could avoid that problem. But that would be our first response, I'm afraid, right now. I was speaking to the nature of those papers right now. But it is the case, though, that I mean, so you say, well, what other institutional arrangements could we use to try to encourage this kind of conversation? And, you know, I know the division has various chat rooms and other kinds of things, but it's costly to write a good dialogue. It's not easy. These dialogues, I was the editor on them, and sometimes I would get additional reviewers, but I was the action editor on them. And they would go through 4 or 5 revisions. This is 8 flipping pages, 4 revisions. You know, this is a wrong word. You know, kind of things, and because it's very costly to write them. You got to publish them in really highly respected top tier spots. So I'm not going to, I personally, and I think a lot of people would make the choice that if a dialogue is, or a conversation takes place on a chat room, you're not going to get carefully crafted, detailed, insightful, theory generating conversations. They're going to be sort of just off the cuff kind of things. I'm not blaming people. I totally understand that. So if you're really going to have the kind of conversations that you were hoping, I was hoping that we would generate with them, and they're not all that good, but some of them reach pretty high levels, then it's going to have to be within the context of a top tier journal. And so AMR is that. SMJ, AMJ could be that. I don't know. We never, when I was serving as an officer at SMJ, SMS, that question about dialogues never really came up at SMJ. Is anyone, we have any AEs, SMJ AEs here? Well, actually, Michael, your journal in many ways has the potential to become that conversation generating experience.
Well, that's would be an aspiration.
Yeah.
I'll make it. I mean, we were really happy. You know, our inaugural issue. You know, there's a nice little debate that's been started between David Teese and Peter Buckley about the future of the field and how we need to change the way we think. Joe Mahoney has a nice essay with Dan Schindel talking about engaged scholarship, reinvigorating some of Andy Vandevend's statement.
Sure.
You know, but obviously we're not. You know. Well, we've been used. I can say this. I'm proud of this. We were used in a tenure conversation this year in a Big Ten institution, so I'm damn happy about that. But we're certainly not top tier. But I do think, you know, to the question is, there's a real disconnect between the private incentives for the faculty and the future of the field, which I think requires that we start engaging in something like these dialogues at AMR. So, well,
I have to say that what the STR division has been doing during the last year or so, I think it even predated the pandemic, but certainly was increased by the pandemic. It's been really, talk about community building. It's just really impressive. I've had a chance to meet with doctoral students practicing their job talks. I mean, it's, you know, and that's something you would do at the academy meetings, but you can't do. And so all these kinds of institutional innovations are good things. But go ahead, Michael.
No, so there is one private question on this topic that came in. Well, not on this topic, but on the doctoral student topic that I thought maybe I jumped a little bit. But there was I have 2 comments that are sort of asking me to raise the question of how you would evaluate. One's on doctoral students and hiring, and one's on junior faculty and sort of tenure. I mean, how do you think about evaluating candidates at those 2 stages? So maybe a few minutes on that, and then we have some other questions coming in from Elena, Tony, and Ian.
Sure. Well, So the evaluating doctoral students and potential doctoral students, evaluating potential assistant professors are completely different processes in my mind. Doctoral students it's really hard because, I mean, what do you have? You have an essay, you have grades, you have a GMAT. We like to talk to them. I
misspoke. So this was sort of hiring assistant professors and then the
okay.
second stage, right? And
okay.
I misspoke. I'm sorry.
No problem. So it's actually my primary criteria for hiring assistant professors. Over and above, are they nice people? Can we get along? Do they seem to have the right, good values? But substantively, it's really simple. Can I learn something from this person? If the answer is no, then, why should I hire them? I don't understand why I want to do that. So if you're asking a question that I've never thought of, or asking a question I've thought of, but coming up with an answer I've never thought of, hey, wow, that's interesting. We're going to look at only students that have been trained at good schools. So they're going to have the methods. They're going to have all that stuff. That using my language, that's a source of competitive parity. Okay. Some people might be really good at that, but everyone's going to be good enough at a pretty high level to be able to do whatever has to be done methodologically and by the way, if you don't know some obscure modeling technique that you actually need, well, it turns out we have people at the University of Utah who do. Okay, so it's not a problem. We can build that capability in you. That's not a hard issue. The real issue is, are you asking interesting questions? And interesting to me is, I've never thought of that question, and I see why it's important. Or, I've been thinking about it for 5 years, and your answer is new to me. That's what I'm looking for. So another version of this question I'm asked sometimes is, some faculty, senior faculty, when they become full professors or sometimes even associate professors, they just stop writing. They just stop research. And I don't want to make anyone a villain here. I understand, because writing's really hard. Getting published is really hard. And so, gee, I can work less hard and have a really good life, or I can do that. And I understand people making those trade-offs. I got family issues. I'm not blaming anyone. For me, I'm in love with the ideas. And you get so excited about the idea that, this is someone said earlier, the paper speaks to you. It reaches out to you. This is Bucky said. It says you have to write this paper. Anita, we've had this conversation. It has to happen. I can't help myself. There's a great quote from Stephen King, the novelist, that I read recently, and he was asked, because he's a very prolific writer. In fact, at one point he actually adopted a pseudonym because the publishers were concerned that it was publishing too much, that it would reduce the value of his brand. So he adopted a pseudonym, and then people figured it out, and so it didn't matter very much. And so people said, "Well, why do you choose to write so much?" And he said, "You think it's a choice? I'm compelled by my ideas. I am compelled by my thoughts to write." And when we talk about loving ideas and loving the writing process and contributing to the concepts, that's where you have to be. That's when you're there. Then when you become a full professor and a sub professor, nothing, in my mind, nothing changed at all. Nothing, except I had more administrative responsibilities. So I was worse off on every dimension. Because I still did exactly the same work that I'd always been doing, and at exactly the same rate with exactly the same purpose, and which was because I was passionate about the work, deeply passionate about the work. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone who we can be passionate together about their work, so I can learn from them. But the promotion to associate professor with tenure, it's even more important. I mean, can you imagine giving someone a lifetime job and then the next thing they do is stop working? and by working, I mean stop writing papers that engaging in conversations and debate. I mean, that's insane. I would never do that on purpose. I want to tenure a person, and oh yeah, you got to have a certain number of A hits. I know all those are counting. We can do that, and it's true. Unless you publish, it doesn't count, right? So you may have the world's best ideas, but unless it gets in a paper and it's not part of the conversation, so it doesn't count so much. But I know people whose objective function, using economic language, whose objective function is making sure that in the 6th year they have 6 top-tier publications. Whether they have any coherence, whether they assign a point of view, whether they are collectively more valuable than they are individually, is not relevant, and that is a problem. It is possible. It's going to shock junior people. It's possible to write too much, you know. We years ago at UCLA, we had a guy, a full professor someplace else, apply for a position, and I've never seen a resume like that since. This is 40 years ago. This guy had like 300-400 publications. He had a table of contents for his resume. I am not exaggerating. All these papers are on page 14 to 23, and these papers are on, I mean, it was unbelievable. And then we all looked at each other and says, how many of you, has anyone read any of these papers? And the answer was no, we're not interested. So yeah.
So an amen to that, but that's just me. And Juiced, thank you for your comment. I'm just going to read this for Jay because it resonated with me. And he says, it's infectious to hear Jay's continued enthusiasm for writing, developing ideas, and contributing to the field. I think that's something for all of us to aspire to. I mean, and it just to me, this segmentation between counting and idea generation is important for us all to consider.
Thank you.
But so Elena Plexenkova, my colleague at Ohio State, had a question
Elena.
Some time ago, so I will ask her to sort of clarify that.
Thank you, Michael. So first, thanks a lot, Jay and Mike. I mean, this is an amazing session. I feel like I'm really, really learning a lot about the field in general. And actually, my question was inspired by your answer to Bookie's question, which was that you take often inspiration from you look at what managers do, what they say, and this gives inspiration for theory contribution. And actually, recently I had this weird experience. I was looking for some, real life illustrations. And when I try to look at what managers say, it kind of comes down to, I don't know if it's correct to call them like micro reasons. Like for instance, I was actually looking something about alliances, and they were saying, yeah, it's about like the personal trust between me and the other CEO. It's like whether our cultures fit. And I kind of had this experience several times. So in a sense, I was wondering, how we should think about this. Like, is it something that, maybe we should start thinking more about integrating micro and macro, or maybe it's actually on the other hand, a blind spot of managers. So you're curious to hear your thoughts on this issue.
Well, the integration of micro and macro already exists in strategy. This is the irony. My own sense is, for example, the hottest area right now in human resource management is strategic human resource management. Under what conditions can human capital be a source of economic profits and competitive advantage? Is that a micro concept or is it a macro concept? And the answer is clearly yes. So there's a lot of that going on. Now, the thing about managers is tricky, okay, because I have, first of all, enormous respect for what they do. I mean, it's like I have enormous respect for high school teachers because you got to be crazy. But then there's junior high school teachers, which is like really crazy. You got to be so dedicated, a special human being. I'm not there, okay? And I think the same way about managers. I mean, every day you got to get up, you got to deal with leadership issues, personnel issues, operational issues. You got to be tough on some people, you got to be nurturing with others, and you got to, those are all really micro. And then you have to choose a strategy and to implement, and all at the same time, plus your family life. So, I mean, I have great admiration. but they're often wrong, you know, about their explanations for things. I use an example from years ago. This company I was working with was doing very, very well. I asked the CEO, I said, why are you guys so successful? He said, oh, it's our top management team. I said, really? He said, oh yeah, we're awesome. Well, we've been together for 20 years. We complete each other's sentences. We make decisions like that. We're all well-educated. Well, we're just awesome. Top management team. I said, great. In my mind, I went, valuable. Tell me about the top management team of your competitors. Oh, they're really good. Okay. It can't be the case that their top management team is a source of competitive advantage if all the top management teams are all really, really good. So he's right. He was right, but he was also wrong. While we learn from managers, while we respect managers, while they create dilemmas for us, you know, we don't always believe their explanations. I don't always believe their explanations. Now, so that's the general point. Now, the specific point on micro and macro, I read an article a long time ago, it was a book chapter, that said that if you take the search for competitive advantage seriously, what you discover is OB. That is, you discover organizational behavior, because it's about people, it's about relationships. It's not about plans, which can be copied and imitated. It's not about strategies per se. It's about the things that make a firm distinctive, and those are almost always a macro flavor: culture, relationships, trust. I wrote an article on trustworthiness as a source of competitive advantage for that reason. And certainly the stuff on student human resources is in that category. I'm not sure that the OB people either are interested or care about that. And so my sense, and is that a lot of OB people, not all of them certainly, the best are not this, but a lot of OB people are really good at talking among themselves and are not interested in the fact that they are the source of our independent variables. So strategy has always been interdisciplinary. It continues to be. It's in the AOM world, it's considered macro, but the theory is deeply multi-level in nature. Some of the research isn't, but that's because it's hard to get micro strategy relevant data. I grant that and I understand that, but the stuff that really matters seems to, from a resource-based view, would be the organizational kinds of phenomena and concepts. So yeah. Now, that's consistent with this emphasis on micro foundations, is consistent with this emphasis on behavioral dimensions of strategy. So we have a lot to do in integrating and making that work, but that seems to me to be a very fruitful way to go. It has been for me, theoretically.
Yeah, we have a question. We have a couple of questions. One from Ali just came. That's just a follow-on to Elena's about the micro foundations movement, and I don't know if maybe you want to clarify that. I mean, one of the things I've tried to think about is if we think about, let's say, the conversation about what our OB colleagues are doing with Big Five personality characteristics, and I've always struggled to make the linkage between narcissism and strategic factor market behavior, but you know, maybe it can be made. Ali, do you have other precise, specific questions you'd like to ask Jay on the micro foundations act?
Ali, you were much more attractive when you had your daughter with you.
Mary wants to participate in every session.
I understand.
That's given. She wants to make sure that I'm doing the right work and it's fruitful.
That's great.
She's 3 years old. She's
really?
3 years old. Yes.
She's a precocious 3-year-old, no doubt.
Thank you so much. I just thought Elena's questions leads us to discussion of the micro foundations, which you've written about. So I would love to hear more about this aspect of theorizing, because I think it's really an interesting perspective, having worked in organizations and now I am in academia, I think it all goes back to the bottom level, to the individual levels, as you've written about that. So I just thought of hearing your thoughts about it. Thank you so much.
First of all, I do have one paper with Teppo on this, and Teppo was really one of the initiators. I used to give Teppo a bad time about the micro foundations movement. I said there are more papers calling for micro foundations than papers on micro foundations. He laughed, so we wrote the paper together. It was a delight because often when I write with co-authors the first time, they'll write something and I'll have to completely rewrite it and really force them to think. But Teppo was a really good writer. I mean, he's amazingly skilled. So that was a wonderful experience. In that paper, we sort of make the argument that if all micro foundations is taking standard OB stuff and dropping it into a strategy context, that's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't really realize the full potential. What we really want to do is we want to say, how does the micro phenomena inside an organization interact in ways that are non-trivial, have non-trivial implications for strategic choices? So the aggregation effects and the interaction across these. So when people talk about behavioral strategy, if behavioral strategy means Kahneman and Tversky applied to strategic decision-making, okay, that's fine. But if behavioral strategy means that the way we think about strategy has to be turned upside down in some more fundamental way, that might include Kahneman and Tversky in prospect theory, then that would be more interesting, I would think. So that's all that paper did was call for that. I don't think we really developed it. I think the development part is, well, again, I apologize going back to my 2018 paper, but I have been thinking about this a long time, and one of the issues in that paper that gets generated is the importance of co-specialized assets in a firm. That is what managers do is they bring co-specialized assets together in a way that generates economic profits, and then they'll distribute those to stakeholders. And this co-specialization process, I don't think we understand it at all. I mean, literally, I can label it, oh, that's co-specialized. But think what that means. That means I'm willing to put my future, financial and organizational future, in your hands, and vice versa. Why does that happen? It's like getting married, for peace sakes. I mean, it's like, and you know, if it doesn't work, it's really costly, and if it does work, it's got this wonderful thing that can come out of it. I don't think we understand that. And that seems like a deeply micro phenomenon. And by the way, how that happens has got to have an impact. How that co-specialization actually evolves in organizations has to have a huge impact on things we do care about deeply, like how our profits actually distributed among stakeholders. I mean, there's got to be a link between those two, and I don't think we. So it's going back to one of Anita's very first questions. Co-specialization is about building community among stakeholders. Is that micro or macro? I can't decide.
If something comes to mind from this statement, is just the work of Paul Krugman about specialization in the areas. Maybe that is something.
This is very possible. It's very possible. The thing about it is, I'm slow these ways. I've actually only come to the point in my thinking where I now recognize that this is a really important question. And usually when that happens, what I do is I try to find a really smart co-author who knows stuff that I don't know, or Bucky knows that I don't know, and say, hey, let's figure this out together. And they'll introduce me to the literature, and then So I was going to say earlier, you were asking about the role of literature in generating ideas. I'm like the world's worst literature person. Just take that as, do not follow my example here. I'm not a good reader. I would much prefer thinking than reading. I remember Jay and I used to have this big stack of unopened journals in the days when we actually got those. Big stack of unopened journals on his desk. And I said, what's that about? He says, well, I'd like to bring the PhD students in. And I say, you see all these journals? These are all the journals I'm not reading so that I can write. I think that's brilliant. Okay, so I've got to think and read and read a few critical things and think deeply about them. But it's helpful to have people who know things like Ali was talking about that I may not know about, and engage that, bring that in part of the conversation.
Thank you. I'm going to jump around a little bit. Ian McFarland has to leave shortly, but had this question about stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
With everybody on this call, that would be probably be
that is actually where Ian lives. That's not a fake background. That's the house.
It's a long story. It's the inside of a old water tower my neighborhood's trying to refurbish.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's wonderful.
It really wasn't a question. I've just seen you in the hallways, Jay, and at AOM meetings, and was really thrilled. And I think it was the Atlanta meeting in 2018 when I had been learning about stakeholder theory at all the meetings, and heard you and Mahoney and others talking about the integration with strategy. And I was just thrilled to hear that, because my company had bought into a kind of a stakeholder framework, and it was kind of a validation, because we had been working so much with strategy, RBV, and other things prior to that. And theretofore, the two hadn't really mixed, at least from my view.
That's right. That's right.
So all good, all good. So it really wasn't a question, just to thank you. And
appreciate that.
I'll see you at the next. I'll be in the audience someplace throwing tomatoes.
Well, it's been a fun process, and there have been several people, 1, 2, 3 people that I can see here that were part of my evolution journey. I have to tell you a funny story. Jim Walsh came to that conference I mentioned earlier in Zion. And he somehow emergence, the concept of emergence came up. Do you remember this, Anita? And I said, I've always thought whenever I heard something as an emergent process, that's code for we don't really know what's going on. So code for ignorance. And Jim Walsh says, would someone give that guy a hug? It's a little bit over the top. So that's awesome. Thanks.
Well, I do have a detailed question. Again, this is my last call for any junior folks with specific questions they want to ask. But Tony Tong has been thinking about big data and maybe the linkages between theory and big data or data-driven studies. So maybe I'll let Tony.
But big data and data-driven studies are two different things, right? So I don't know anything about big data. I feel comfortable in reviewing my ignorance. My suspicion is that big data will allow us to sometimes find small effects that are important theoretically. I mean, as ends get bigger, everything is significant, right? So,
right.
But I think the problem with big data is one of the problems with big data has to be, or at least a concern you should have, is that you are constrained in big data typically by questions that other people are asking rather than the questions you're asking. So Amazon collects big data to do, say for example, to do pricing or to do product differentiation, say to do pricing studies. If you price it here, what happens to demand, price it here? It's really interesting if you're interested in pricing, but what if you're not interested in pricing? So I would hate to become a slave to the data generation questions that someone else was asking. Now, if it turns out that the questions you are asking are perfectly aligned with the data that was collected in big data, then that sounds like a wonderful outcome. And then how can you say that's a bad thing? Setting aside ethical and other issues, but assuming all that is in place, then yeah, then big data is a fine tool. I mean, big data to me is like it's like any methodological approach. If it helps you address an important theoretical question, then awesome. If it doesn't, I don't care. I mean, I'm just not interested in big data per se. I'm only interested in the extent that big data or two-stage least squares or instrumental or whatever, how you want to do it. I'm only interested can those methods help me understand a core issue or core question that's important in the field of strategy. And maybe they can, but I haven't seen a lot of proof of that yet, but maybe, I mean, I'm ignorant, so I acknowledge that.
So thanks Jay for for sharing your thoughts about big data, especially with regard to complementing our research question that we pursue. My questions also has a sort of a teaching component to that. And so what I've learned from the graduate school, from you and many other great teachers on this panel, is that we teach strategy concepts and frameworks or theories using case studies, right? So that's the sort of I would say the typical approach that has been used in strategy teaching for for years,
Sure.
for decades.
Sure.
Now, something that's I think it's increasingly the case is that I feel that especially for middle managers, I would think. So managerial decision making, I would think, is increasingly big data driven. And here, big data is not just in terms of the quantity, but also in terms of the the complexity, also the types of data that we have, and the instantaneous kind of nature of big data. So how would this trend, I would say, in this increasingly big data driven decision making impact the sort of the content and also the ways that we teach strategic management concepts, especially to MBAs and to master students? And what we've seen, I think, in the business school, in other divisions or other departments, that they integrate analytics with, say, marketing, for example, marketing analytics or information analytics. So is that something that we could do? Let's say strategy analytics, maybe, that we can create, or maybe that has already been created, that, but I'm not really aware of. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
So let me try to be provocative, Tony, as
Right.
you always would prefer, I think. So I think we teach just enough statistical analysis in the MBA program to make our students really dangerous. I mean, everyone here knows how hard it is to rigorously fit a model to data, really carefully and systematically and thoughtfully. And there may be managers out there who can do that, but actually I've never met them. Now, there may be, and maybe what you're talking about is a change ultimately to incorporating analytical approaches to strategic management more deeply into organizations. And certainly consulting firms can do those kinds of things. But when you ask a middle manager, here's some data, we want you to run a regression and based on that make a decision, they'll get it wrong most of the time because it's hard to do right. Because if it was easy to do, it would be much easier to write all these papers. But I had to have a more fundamental question about that as well, which is that let's imagine a world, am I a theorist or what? Let's imagine a world where your vision, Tony, actually is implemented. That is, these data analytical techniques are taught, are absorbed, are used.
I know where he's going.
Well, if they're not going to be a source of economic profits, where's the competitive advantage here? We would all have roughly the same data. We would all analyze them about the same way. Yeah, I'm sorry, Rich. It's almost boring at some point. and so, I heard it said this way. It was by an accounting person. It was shocking. She said, if you can write something down and measure it very, very carefully, it's not going to be a source of economic profits. So in some sense, that doesn't deny the importance of doing analytical work when you can, because you want to get to that competitive parity point. But in the end, strategy if strategies is interested in generating appropriate economic profits, then there's another level that has to sort of be, we have to be thinking about something, do all the analytics, and then something else beyond that is the source of competitive advantage. Sorry, Rich, that was sort of predictable.
Well, I think what I will do is ask the penultimate question. So I'm going to leave the honor for the final stream of questions to Asim, unless something else comes in. But as we get to the end of our second hour, is there, you know, looking back, so I hate to ask this question because it seems like looking back on your career, but
No,
are there,
I am old, look at my hair.
Well,
It's not gray, it's light black, so very, very light black.
with that introduction, I will share, well, I remember you used to tell this joke about somebody coming to an academy meeting and Jay Barney, you must be, I thought you were dead.
That's right, no, that actually did happen, that's not a joke. Doctoral students said, you're Jay Barney? I thought you were dead. Well, only in some ways, I think.
Well, I have felt that this summer with the
Yes.
coronavirus, so maybe I'm getting to that age. But as you think about this, you know, are there challenges, are there lessons in the career, sort of this overarching? Maybe this is reflecting back on some of the opening comments from Anita and others about community building. But are there lessons in your career, challenges or triumphs you might be willing to share with the group, sort of to wrap?
Sure, I think that. So when I was an assistant professor, I was deeply ambitious. Part of it was practical. I mean, I had a family to feed and house and things, but deeply ambitious and pretty obnoxious. Always worked by myself because no one was. I mean, I just wanted to do it myself, have control. And probably one of the reasons it took me so long. I had great mentors, don't get me wrong, Bill Ochi, Dick Ramel, Bill McKelvey, but I was pretty much a lone wolf. And then looking back, the thing that I actually have come to value is the relationships, the friendships I have with people. I've told this story before, and so I'll try to tell it. This is Helly Wang. This is a story with Helly Wang. She was a PhD student of mine at Ohio State, and she hates it when I tell this story and she's in the room. So, Helly was incredibly smart. And I know that doesn't surprise anybody because we've seen what she's done since then. But I used to have a end of the first year meeting with the PhD students and ask them what their research interests are. And, you know, after the first year, sometimes they're not very well developed. Helly had 3 ideas, all of which were subsequently published in A journals. So after her first year in the PhD program, she just had this intuition for interesting ideas. But I was when she got married and when she had her first baby. Anyway, she moved to University of Hong Kong Science and Technology in Hong Kong. Great school, great place. I hope it remains so. But and so she invited me, and I went there for a week. And I hadn't seen her or her family. Her first daughter's name was Joy. I hadn't seen her in 5 years. So she was a baby when I last saw her, and now she's a 5-year-old girl, right? And there's an apartment that you stay in, that I stayed in on campus. And they called, Helly called down from downstairs, and I came down. And Helly was staying over there. And then there was this little 5-year-old girl, just playing and dancing. You know how they do, just playing and dancing. And then she looked at me. She said, she looked at her mom. She said, "Grandpa Jay?" That's what this is about, guys. I mean, come on, Grandpa Jay. I'm her dissertation advisor. We're co-authors on papers. But that's what it's really about, is those friendships and relationships and things we. So if the objective function is to get the next paper published, which was for much of my life, that was a mistake. I'm not saying that that's unimportant. We got to get the next paper published. I got it. But the process of creating that next paper is a deeply social process that we develop these relationships, and that's the thing. That's the thing. So.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. And so I think I'm going to transition to a lighter note.
Please.
And Asim, I know Asim's going to rapid fire you in the way, only the way he can.
Asim is awesome.
And if somehow this doesn't work, I will make sure we come back with other interesting questions.
Okay.
Actually, I'm going to rapid fire you in the way that only Samina really can, but since she's not here, I'm going to try to do my best imitation of her.
Okay.
So Jay, first off, just, thank you so much. It's just, it's always inspiring, always enlightening. I'm almost sad to bring down the tone of the conversation by asking you these questions, but I'm going to do it anyway, because that's pretty much my role, as you know, in the intellectual community, which is to make everything ridiculous. Set of rapid fire questions just to get to know you better as a person. Sure. What do you like to do to unwind?
To unwind? In the last few months, my wife and I are taking a binge watching BBC murder mysteries. We're watching, what's his name? George Gently, a long time ago. So I have, in more normal times, I ski. I love to ski. So where I live is 12 miles from the base of Park City Mountain Resort. So I'm one of those disgusting people who look out and say, "Yeah, there's a cloud. I'm not going skiing today." So I take advantage of that. And then in the rest of the year, we have ridden bicycles. My wife and I ride bikes, road bikes. I tried to do mountain biking recently and almost got killed. So I'm not sure if I'm moving on that one yet. But
okay.
Oh, by the way, the other thing I do. What's that?
Have you done? I mean, you did the Pyrenees a couple of years ago, several years ago.
Oh yeah,
have you done anything like that?
We did talking about building community. One of the things we did when I first moved to the University of Utah, it wasn't my idea, but I thought it was a great idea, is that we had a departmental bike ride, and about half of the department went, and we rode bikes from Lyon, France to Barcelona, Spain, and over 10 days, and those of us who were on that trip still build on that today. So it was fun. I also listen to music. My wife was very generously purchased a awesome amplifier. Digital amplifiers are fine. This is a tube-based amplifier. It's just magnificent. Yeah. So listen to some good music.
Favorite genre of music?
Ooh. The 60s, 1860s, 1960s. I actually, Anita knows this, I love opera. I love opera. And it is the case that I can turn some arias on that I've heard 1,000 times, and it still brings tears to my eyes every time.
So are you a Wagner person or a Verdi person?
No, Verdi. Wagner was a little too heavy duty. But I mean, I wish I had that talent, but no, more Verdi than Wagner.
Okay. You were talking about travel earlier. Favorite city?
Oh, favorite cities. Wow. So, that's going to be a cop-out because my favorite cities are where my favorite people are. So I have some great friends in Barcelona. I love to go to Barcelona. I'm from California originally. My parents were in Northern California, but I go back to California now. It's a little too crowded for my taste. LA is out of control, so I don't spend much time there.
I can see how living in Utah, right in the ski slopes, you may not be so excited about.
It's really an interesting problem because people say, "Where are you going on vacation?" I say, "Yeah, I'm staying here." People come here to go on vacation, so we just hang out here, and we're good.
Okay, so reading outside of work, fiction or nonfiction?
Almost all nonfiction.
And like what type of nonfiction? Philosophy, memoirs?
Histories and biographies. Histories and biographies. In fact, you can't see, but this entire wall of books over here is all 90% histories and biographies. I find great inspiration. It's actually in part of the theory of development. When you understanding how leaders in prior centuries were able to motivate individuals to do incredible things. I have a favorite story about Robert E. Lee. I know he's a Confederate general, and that's not popular right now, but as you can be a leader in a bad cause, but he was an amazing leader. He was loved by his men, and one of his worst decisions in the history of the Civil War was called Pickett's Charge, which was at Gettysburg. Pickett's Charge was a brigade that was asked to walk across an open field 1.5 miles long, attacking a Union position that was defended by a stone wall, and the casualty rates were 80%. It was disastrous. And basically, it was called the high point of the Civil War for the Confederacy, because after that, it was all downhill from there. Anyway, those 20% of the people who were left who could walk back to the starting point in some trees, General Lee on his horse Traveler rides up and he's deeply apologetic. He's apologizing to these men. It's all my fault. I asked you to do something that couldn't be done. And these men who had just experienced Pickett's Charge said, that's not true, General. That's not true. Let us reform and we'll hit him again. They were willing to do that again because they loved General Lee. That's interesting. Powerful, obviously, but it's interesting. How does a leader have that kind of relationship with his or her subordinates? Yeah. That's fascinating. So anyway, history.
Sounds kind of like the R&R process, but 80% of your paper gets killed and then you have to send back. So just building on that, so if you could have dinner with a famous leader or from history, who would you pick?
Oh, famous leader from history. Oh, James. I'm just thinking quick off my head. Several came to mind, but Winston Churchill is a very impressive fellow to me, and he is an interesting combination of arrogance and humility and racism and globalism, and he's certainly a man of his times, but he would be interesting to hang around with, I think. So
yeah,
almost as interesting as Anita.
Well, with Anita, you don't get the cigar smoke, so there you go.
True. That's true.
Team, you haven't hung out with me enough.
Ooh, okay then. We'll get to you, Anita, like on next Thursday. Favorite dessert, Jay?
A favorite dessert? I'll probably just say ice cream. Yeah, unfortunately.
Favorite flavor of ice cream? You can't get away with that.
Chocolate chip mint. It's really boring. I know.
No, it's good. Okay, I'm going to ask one last. I'm very tempted to ask you the difference between RBV and transaction costs. I think I'll spare us all that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this, Jay. Again, on behalf of the division, I'm going to hand it back to Michael, but just thanks so much. And thanks also for, you mentioned this earlier, thanks for being part of the PhD network shops as well.
That was really informative for me.
Michael, all yours.
Yeah. So let me just close again. Let's all, maybe we can knock on wood. Thanks to Jay. This has been a fantastic 2 hours for me. I'm just, having sat through several of these, all the questions were great, and I judge my success by how little I talk. So hopefully we did okay. So thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Michael.
And look forward to seeing everybody again in person, hopefully as soon as possible.
All righty. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.